What up, Randies? My name is Stan from RandomTens, and today we'll be taking a look at debatably the strongest creatures in Pokemon lore. Whether you love them, hate them, or believe they're a little overrated, Dragon types are among some of the most powerful and most popular Pokemon the series has ever produced. And regardless of what you may feel about the typing as a whole, there's no denying that at one point these beasts became so revered that an entirely new type had to be added into the game in order to counteract their overwhelming power. That, my friends, is influence. And so across the 6 regions and 52 confirmed species of Dragon-type Pokemon, I've created a countdown of the 7 best dragons in Pokemon history. In order to make it fair, I've used a system in which each Pokemon featured on the list has been ranked in 3 distinctive ways. These categories include stats and abilities, design, and impact on the series as a whole. So sorry competitive fans, but this is a list encompassing more than just stats and raw power alone. Also, I've made a rule not to include any legendaries or mega evolutions, because let's be honest, Rayquaza would beat out every single Pokemon in terms of stats and impact alone, and that just doesn't seem fair. Besides, legendary Pokemon seems like a great topic for another video entirely. And finally, I'm going to forewarn you guys here, every Pokemon on this countdown is fully evolved. Personally, I would put Dragonair in my top 3, but based on the criteria I've ranked this list by, primary and mid-evolution simply can't compete with their more mature forms. It's nothing personal, I just want to keep this countdown as fair as possible. So with all of those boring rules out of the way, grab your cape and let's get into it. Here are the top 7 Dragon Pokemon ever created. Number 7. Haxorus is one of those Pokemon that I immediately gravitated towards during my playthrough of Pokemon White. It's a solid dragon type with a diverse move pool that falls into many of the evolutionary tropes of its draconic peers. However, there are a few reasons it appears so low on this list. Firstly, in terms of overall viability, although Haxorus is amazing with its insane 147 base attack stat, it's still only a semi-pseudo-legendary Pokemon with a base stat total of 540. Now, in almost every other group of Pokemon, this would be considered godlike, but compared with the other dragon types on this list, Haxorus just can't keep up. Couple those lower end numbers with the fact that it probably never got the love it quite deserved throughout other mediums like the Pokemon anime series and films, and you can see why the Jaw Pokemon, although adored, just can't compete with even some of the dragon Pokemon from its own generation. Personally, I think the most memorable thing about Haxorus' impact on the series is either being Drayden and Iris' final prize Pokemon in the games, or how you could battle a shiny iteration in Black and White 2 once you completed the Unova Dex, which once again definitely is an impact on the series. It's just a puddle compared to the waves created by other Pokemon featured on this countdown. In fact, the only reason Haxorus even makes this list at all comes down to its design. With its solid yellow, black, and red color scheme and its mandible-like jaws, this is a dragon Pokemon that stands out among your typical dragon designs, and in my personal opinion, Haxorus is the second best designed Gen 5 dragon out of them all. And that's in a generation where the legendary mascots are friggin' dragons. But even with its phenomenal design, Haxorus still just sort of feels like a wasted opportunity, and honestly deserved much better. Number 6. This next Pokemon is one of the all-time greatest sweepers in the history of competitive battling. It's flexible, it's durable, but most of all, it's an absolute powerhouse. Salamence is the first of many pseudo-legendary Pokemon to make an appearance on this countdown, and like Haxorus, makes for a dynamite attacker on any competitive team. Unlike Haxorus, however, this monster definitely holds its own with fairly balanced stats across the board. Throw on a Mega Stone and you have debatably the most powerful non-legendary dragon-type Pokemon in the metagame. On top of that, Salamence is a fairly popular Pokemon, with many appearances spanning mediums like manga and movies, and even most recently appeared as Zinnia's key Pokemon in the Delta episode of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. So then why did this popular Pokemon with incredible stats and a Mega Evolution only make it to 6th place? Well, as controversial as it may be, I think that compared to the other dragons on this list, Salamence and even Mega Salamence have fairly generic designs. Don't get me wrong, I love Salamence and used one on my team in my original copy of Ruby. It's just so many of these dragon Pokemon have something that sets them apart or makes them extremely memorable, and Salamence just sort of looks like a dragon. In fact, Salamence is actually categorized as the dragon Pokemon in the National Dex. That's it. I know it's meant to resemble a salamander, but with its ferocious nature and typical dragon design, I just think Salamence lacks some of the personality its peers have. Also, if anything, I feel like Salamence's increased competitive viability and bump in popularity post-Gen 6 is a direct result of Game Freak trying to spice him up and make him retroactively more memorable, because even they realized he'd sort of taken a backseat to some of their better designs. However, I still feel like Salamence is worthy of all of the praise it gets. There's just a few dragons that have much more personality, including the very next Pokemon on this list. Number 5. I have a weird feeling that this next Pokemon is one of the most secretly popular of the entire franchise. I know in surveys and polls it's characters like Charizard and Mewtwo who reign supreme, but I believe that anyone who's actually put hundreds of combined hours into the games will agree that Flygon is one of the absolute coolest. Now, it's obvious that this goggle-headed dragonfly doesn't hold a candle to Salamence when it comes to power. In fact, of all of the creatures on this list, Flygon has the worst base stats at a measly 520. But unlike that dragon Pokemon, Flygon has personality in spades. It's certainly not enough to make it number 1, stats do factor in after all, but I personally feel like Flygon has debatably the most creative and unique dragon design in the entire series. Known as the Mystic Pokemon, Flygon is the only dragon type that actually belongs as a part of the Bug Egg group, and boy does it show. This Pokemon, commonly mistaken to have roots in the world of dragonflies, is actually based on an insect called the antfly, and with its cool green and red tones and goggle-like crimson eyes, you'd better believe it stands out among the series' best. Despite not having an incredibly memorable role within the games, Flygon has appeared in 4 of the 19 Pokemon films so far, and even had a prominent role in Jirachi Wishmaker, cementing it as a hero in the minds of kids everywhere. In fact, Flygon was actually deemed popular enough to have a Mega Evolution in the Gen 3 remakes, but artist Ken Sugimori has admitted to having artist block when trying to come up with a new design. Think about that for a second. Flygon's design is so unique that even the guy who created it doesn't know how to improve the look. If that's not good enough for the number 5 spot, then I don't know what else to say. Number 4. Okay, so these final 4 Pokemon all have a ton of things in common. They're all pseudo-legendaries with a base stat total of 600, they all have unique traits or design quirks that give them personality or an identity, and they've all made their fair share of memorable appearances across the series' lifespan, and definitely have had an impact. So how do I proceed with this countdown knowing that the race is so tight and the playing field is this narrow? Well, all I can do is try and explain my decision for why I believe, according to the criteria I've set, that each monster deserves its spot. Some will disagree, and that's perfectly fine, because nostalgia and opinion sort of have to factor in a little bit from here on out. My point is that all of these final 4 Pokemon are positive additions to the franchise, and it was incredibly tough to rank any one over the others. Okay, we good? In the number 4 spot, we have everyone's favorite shiny, Garchomp. This mock Pokemon is most famously known as Cynthia's partner in crime, and it's undebatable that Garchomp is one of the best designs to come out of Sinnoh. With its shark-like appearance and aerodynamic design, this attacker, like Salamence, makes for the perfect sweeper on any team, and its Mega Evolution is a staple in many online battles. The reason I place Garchomp out of the top 3 is mostly because I don't feel like it's as memorable a Pokemon as the next entries on this list. Its design is admittedly very cool, but at the end of the day, it's still just a dragon with giant claw hands and little personality beyond its association with Cynthia. But once again, I can't state enough that this Pokemon is as awesome as it is ruthless on the battlefield. It's just not quite as impactful as the final 3. Number 3. This dragon Pokemon will go down in history as a pioneer. It was the first fully evolved dragon type in the series, the first pseudo-legendary, and the pain-in-the-butt partner Pokemon of the one and only Lance. The thing is, regardless of how impactful it's been, due to being the first, Dragonite will always fall short when it comes to creativity. Now, that's not to say that it's not memorable, because it absolutely is. From that early episode where it was cloaked in shadows, to its role on Lance's team, all the way to the one Iris used in the black and white cartoon, if you've been around since the first generation, then you know how charming and full of life Dragonite is. But as it stands, I'd be a hypocrite if I didn't follow my own rules when examining number 149, and the simple truth is, Game Freak has made more creative dragon types since its debut in 1996. In fact, I think it could be argued that Dragonair is actually better designed than its orange evolution. There are, however, two reasons why Dragonite made it this far on the countdown, despite being the most generic-looking dragon Pokemon of them all. The first is that, because it was the original, I have to give it a little more leeway than those that came after. This is why, despite sort of having the same problems with Salamence and Garchomp, Dragonite still surpasses them. The second reason is because of its impact and personality. We are talking about the OG pseudo-legendary. For a time, Dragonite was the ultimate non-legendary Pokemon, and a template for what dragon Pokemon could become. It's powerful, it's adorable, and it's memorable as hell, and that, my Pokepals, is why Dragonite deserves its spot this high on the list, even if the Gen 1ers will be livid. Number 2. The number 2 spot on this countdown belongs to the only Pokemon I can say may have a cooler design than Flygon, but unlike that Hoenn outlier, this dragon Pokemon is the newest to the pseudo-legendary club, making it both powerful and unique. If you haven't figured it out yet, I'm talking about everyone's favorite slug monster, the one and only Goodra. In my opinion, Goodra is one of the greatest strokes of genius that Game Freak's ever had. Taking their traditional OP dragon archetype and making it softer both figuratively and literally was a winning formula that surely resonated with a brand new generation of Pokemon fans, the same way Dragonite had an effect on us. Unlike most of the other pseudos, Goodra's strength lies in its insane 150 base special defense stat, but don't let its appearance fool you. Goodra can also manage some pretty devastating offensive power if you know what you're doing. But I will admit that this dragon type doesn't even begin to compare to the competitive viability of creatures like Salamence. So why is Goodra at number 2? Well, besides its iconic design and exceptional stats, Goodra is really the only dragon-type Pokemon that ever got a chance to shine through the anime series. Ash's Goodra is considered one of his most fleshed out and impactful allies ever, and trust me when I say that the amount of exposure this one dragon has received, especially in Japan, is probably more than the other 6 on this list combined. I know some will disagree with me, either because they dislike Gen 6 or because he's not a perfect competitive Pokemon, but Goodra checks off all of the boxes, and in some ways exceeds them, making it overall the second best Dragon-type Pokemon ever. But which Pokemon could somehow surpass all of that? Well, let's find out. Number 1. Look, there's going to be a ton of people who will comment and say the number 1 spot was chosen just to be controversial or for pure shock value, but I urge you to listen to me first and then give your opinion. Based on all of the criteria I've stated, I believe that Hydreigon is the best Dragon-type Pokemon that Game Freak's ever made. I'm aware that it's nowhere near as recognizable as Garchomp, not even close to being as good in battle as Salamence, and probably not even as unique as Goodra, but this Pokemon stands apart because, like the aforementioned Slug Dragon, it succeeds in all 3 areas and more. First of all, Hydreigon is impactful to the series by simply being an original in many different fields. Its evolutionary line is the only one of its kind to possess both Dragon and Dark typing. It's also the Pokemon that takes the most levels to evolve, finally turning into the Brutal Pokemon at level 64. Unless you're Getsis, of course. But most of all, I think it's Hydreigon's myth-based design that makes it stand out among the other dragons on this list. Steeped in the Japanese legends of the Yamato no Orochi, Hydreigon is based on the myth's eponymous dragon with 8 heads, who was finally slain by the hero Susanoo. Now, obviously Game Freak scaled back the number of heads to avoid confusion from players, but the fact remains that with such creative folklore surrounding it, it feels like the team took special care when designing this draconic Hydra. Throw in the fact that Game Freak and the Pokemon Company used him as both the pseudo-boss in Generation 5, as well as a staple character while promoting the movies and games from that generation, and you have a character both historical and impactful on the series. And don't forget that this Pokemon is still one of the strongest and most versatile dragons in the entire series, even without a Mega Evolution, and was so infallible for a time that it became one of the poster boys for why we needed a type like Fairy to better balance the game. You can disagree if you want to, and as I mentioned in the number 4 spot, the top 4 are so close it almost doesn't matter. But because of its rich design history, brutally good stats, originality, and exposure to audiences, it's only fair that Hydreigon earns its spot as the number 1 best dragon Pokemon ever. Well, that's all the time we have for today's episode, but you should know that had this been a top 8 list, Altaria definitely would have made the cut. Make sure you let me know your favorite Dragon-type Pokemon in the comments section below, and subscribe to RandomTens for more delish Pokemon goodness. Next week, I'll be back with an episode of the rarest GameCube games ever released, but until then, as I always say, happy hunting, baby rhinos! Babies! Baby Hulk. I'm gonna put a picture of Baby Hulk right here. Right here. It's not a dragon. Not a dragon. Baby Hulk. Go smash.